All right, I wanted to welcome back Erica L. Satifka. We're continuing our discussion. The first segment is episode 7. If you take a look at that, you can learn all about her background and what she writes. This segment is going to be a little bit more, how should we say, delicate. So right now in the cultural zeitgeist, there's a lot of deplatforming based on speech, whether or not you consider it violence or not. And there's a lot of debate and there's a lot of contention in that area. So Erica and I are going to talk a little bit about where we see it today, where we see it going, and what things writers can do and content creators can do to mitigate some of these things. If we even agree that that's okay. There's a competing worldview that says it's okay to cancel certain things, and in many cases there might be an argument for it. But we're going to talk a little bit about when we both think this started, why it's happening, and how we get out of it. So, Erica, we were initially, at least in the last segment, we talked a little bit about COVID and your experience with COVID. How is this something that kind of came before, sort of sprouted up during COVID, or is this something that you think was accentuated or amplified by the COVID experience?
I mean, it's always kind of existed, the whole canceling, people not thinking free speech is important. If you go back even into like the 90s, there's attempted cancellations.
The moral majority, the right did it.
Moral majority, the Tipper Gore, like we're going to slap things all over music. And back then, the canceling attempts came pretty much exclusively from the right, whether it was a Democrat labeled right or a Republican labeled right, because like Tipper Gore is one of the biggest ones, but she's a social conservative.
And it tended to come from the religious right, particularly.
Oh, and then the satanic panic stuff, all that.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing.
And then you get into the aughts, and then it's they were always trying to like the whole Jixie Chicks thing, the whole you can't say anything bad about the United States government, you can't do basically a lot of canceling around that. But the first time I think I, really saw a huge thing. Again, I'm sure there were other, scattered stories, but the first one I remember being a big, blunder for the left was the Charlie Hebdo shootings in 2015, where a bunch of Charlie Hebdo is a French periodical that they publish a lot of cartoons that are political and often tasteless, and they published one of, I think it was the Prophet Muhammad with his head is like a bomb, and a bunch of terrorists went in and shot up all the writers and the editors and everybody at the office. And that was the first time I really saw a lot of people kind of hedging with like, well, they didn't deserve it, but, or saying, well, those cartoons were tasteless, but, and it's like, there's like a dozen dead people here. This is not a, it's like, there's nothing that people can do. Words are never, I take the, strong at this point in history thing that words are not violence. Words are just words, and violence is violence. And there's clearly only one side committing violence there. So that's where I really feel like a lot of this began. And, and it feels like it's just kind of gotten worse since then. And Trump also threw a lot on the fire, because it got to be a point where, like, either if you're pro-Trump or anti-Trump, there were people trying to say there were people trying to say like, oh, well, we can't show like the State of the Union address because it's violence to show Trump. And it's like, he's the president. You kind of have to show, don't you want to know what he's thinking? And then on the other hand, you had Trump, like kind of, there was that one thing where Kathy Griffin had a very graphic thing of Trump being beheaded. And I know you already know all this, but in case anybody doesn't.
No, this is good.
Trump White House was like, this is horrible. You can't do this. And it's like, this is just this is what people do to like people in power. This is how people talk about things. This is like, meme culture. This is goes beyond it. It's just and people were just getting really, really hepped up about it. And then COVID hit, and then everything just completely exploded.
Unhinged.
Yeah, so it's a gradual process, and you can't really even. That's where I kind of point at because before that it was like, sure, like conservatives are going to hedge and be like, oh well, this isn't really a big deal, or whatever. But I never really expected it from the left, other than like maybe some random like Maoists, but like who really talks to Maoists kind of thing.
Yeah, I think it goes. So I agree with everything you're saying about kind of when it really heightened. I think in terms of the infrastructure and the technology, um, it kind of acted as an accelerant to all this. And I think
Mm-hmm.
if you go back to kind of the early 90s, it all started with the internet, in my opinion,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the reason that's important is what the before that time, so pre-internet for all the kiddos who weren't born yet, everybody had more or less a pretty confined and sanitized flow of information, right? You had kind of the three major networks. You had CNN. I think Fox probably started in the 90s, I think, right? So
They
kind of,
did, but I don't think they were really had a strong conservative bent, and then they also weren't just that popular yet. Because I don't think we got Fox News until like 99 or something.
yeah, you had like Fox had like 21 Jump Street, right? It made like Johnny Depp
Mm-hmm.
Depp like a superstar. So you kind of have, and then CNN was actually relatively new too. It was a new concept, maybe late 80s with Ted Turner, and it was this network just like MTV where they used to only play music. You only play news 24/7. So at the beginning of that, there was still a very homogenous information flow for Americans, and there might have been some deviation left and right in how that was skewed. So so the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal sort of thing, but it was still relatively regulated. What the internet effectively did was open it up completely to different sources of information and different views. So that it kind of starts to take you through the 90s, and then what was it? When did the Drudge Report kind of come out? I think that might have been one of the
That
first.
was like I think when I was in college, so like early aughts. I remember that as like 2001 or something when that was a big deal.
Yeah, so I think that was kind of the beginning of alternate media, and I think at the same time you have the Fox News effect, where Fox did extremely well by catering to kind of the right, or the conservative viewpoint, and skewing in that direction a little bit more, which started to take market share away from competitors. I think MSNBC kind of started to rise at that point. And then I think when 9/11 kind of briefly brought the country together, but also greatly restricted exactly what you're talking about, right? If you were like a Barbara Lee, right, in Berkeley, I
Mm-hmm.
think was absolutely ostracized for saying like maybe we shouldn't be looking for somebody to punch right away. Maybe we should be trying to figure that out. And then I remember they let the bodies hit the floor. That song, they took it off the radio, right,
Mm-hmm.
because of the trauma and things like that. So there were definitely threads that were starting to.
And I remember for a while you couldn't show the Twin Towers. Like I think they can't. They didn't show one of the episodes of The Simpsons for a while because there's like a prominent view of like the Twin Towers, and so you had to kind of like not show that anymore.
It was in the Sopranos intro too,
Mm-hmm.
right? Same sort of thing. So the country was kind of traumatized for that. And at the same time, you had like the Patriot Act, which gives the government unprecedented authority to take um, vacuum up information and things like that. So we kind of get through that where there's certainly some censorship, but it hasn't gotten to the kind of the outrageous point yet. Then we invade Iraq. And then the media kind of provides information that suits the narrative that generates ratings, because you have that Fox News effect that starts to happen, and they start to do things that initially kind of helped gin up the kind of the war hysteria and things like that. And then when in Iraq the worst, and it was kind of near an election, they started to show kind of the opposite footage. So, and this is going to be controversial what I'm going to say, so you don't have to. What personally drives me nuts is that even to this day, and this is part of the thread, like all of this is contributing to the fact that the media is getting, I don't know, more and more sloppy or more narrative driven rather than fact based. And then you have the internet with alternate information. People are starting to not trust that source of information. At the same time, we talked about Google, Google I think went public in 2003, and the algorithm with Google is, they make their money through ads, and in order to kind of keep your eyeballs on the page, your search results are going to be slightly different, and these algorithms are going to learn, and the algorithms are going to cater to the things that you want to see and hear. So you already kind of germinated a seed which started to spread and diverge portions of the population, which were increasingly less likely to be looking at these news sources, or looking at these news sources that were also diverging for views. So where was I going with this? It's very complex.
The internet has been a massively destabilizing event in pretty much. If there's still humans in like 1,000 years, and we still like have the ability to know what the internet was, or we still use it, I don't know what people are doing in 1,000 years, but we are going to see the internet as being a mixed bag at best kind of thing, because it's going to be, because yes, I totally agree that the way that because it's all about money. It's like all about, it's not even about ideology. It's not about anything specific. All of the news agencies would turn around tomorrow and support different narratives if they thought that would bring them more cash. You'll see it after the next election. If the next election kind of goes the way a lot of us believe is going to go, you're going to see a lot of narratives change within 24 hours. And it's just, I think living through the pandemic just showed me just how fake the media is. I mean, I always kind of knew it, even back when I was like, college age leftist, learning things about like how the media operates. It's like, no, it's even worse than that now.
Oh, it's so now I remember what I was going to say. It's going to be controversial, but it's true. So when the narrative turned in the Iraq War, because U.S. forces hadn't found any weapons of mass destruction yet, that became the story forever. But in 2014, the New York Times, in October of 2014, the New York Times, reported that in kind of 2006, something like that. And the name of the article is it's called "The Secret Casualties of the Iraq War" or something like that. And what it showed is that we did find chemical weapons in Iraq. Now, not active programs, right? So if somebody says that Saddam had never had, or didn't have active programs when we invaded, that would be a correct statement. He didn't have a nuclear program when we invaded. That's a correct statement. But if you listen to NPR today, like they will say in one breath that we never found weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And we absolutely found, in that article in particular, there's 2,400 sarin, sarin tipped warheads and things like that. But the point is, I'm not debating whether or not it was right to go into the war or anything like that. But my only point here is that once that narrative is cemented, it's very difficult to change or look at. And even if you read the New York Times article, it's very apologetic and like, well, these are old weapons, they were degraded, they weren't. But I guarantee you, if you ask that reporter, here's 1 teaspoon from that sarin warhead, why don't you dip your finger in and tell me what happens, right? And I'd be like, no. So there were a lot of people in the military, particularly explosive ordnance disposal people, who were finding this stuff, and they're like, "That's just not like that's not true. It's not true." I worked at a controversial company that was in the news constantly, and I was in an event that the media reported on. I was 10 feet away from what happened, and the way that they characterized it, like, it was just completely untrue. And once you see enough about that, if there are things you're personally involved in, and they're not getting like the simple things right there, what else aren't they getting right? And I think this is kind of something that has been pervasive throughout. And at the end of the day, I don't think this is anything new in terms of how elites report news and disseminate information to the population. It's just that with the democratization of the information from the internet, it made it much more difficult for those elites to constrain that narrative that they wanted to tell. And make no mistake, there's a book I read by an Iraqi nuclear scientist. A guy's name is Kadir Hamza, and Western intelligence agencies were always looking for him. So one technique that they would use is, at least one technique that he specifically mentions, and he doesn't know for sure if they did this, but typically if you want to find somebody you're looking for, you call a reporter, and that reporter you develop a relationship with. You might give them 5 exclusive things, and then the 6th thing, like, just report this. It's not really, just put it out there. This is what we think. And that report will be something like, Kadir Hamza's dead. And if you see your name in the news and it says you're dead, what do? You reach out to every relative. No, I'm still here. I'm in Libya right now. I'm right here. Right? And then, you get droned. So there's certainly a relationship between Western intelligence agencies and the media, that, and particularly this generation of journalists, they're more apt. I think back in the day when we were much younger, right? There was a little bit more scrutiny, right? There was more money for investigative journalism, and now it's just like, well, the CIA and FBI said that this happened, so it happened, and there's much less of a critical eye on getting multiple sources. Not saying things as definitive, but just saying so and so reported X, so and so, however, said Y, and not saying like the Russians are really bad right now, right? Like injecting opinion into the articles. It's like a whole generation of, and I don't necessarily know if it's their fault. It's just that's how they get ratings. That's how they.
Mm-hmm.
So
if you
that
need the click.
Yeah, and that's part of the story. So we get back to this Google thing. You accelerate it when you get to Facebook, and people curate their own social networks, and at the same time, and I keep adding a national security element to it, but it's just unfortunately the way I look at the world. So bear with me, audience, if you're. But it also in a world where the U.S. is the preeminent peer competitor when it comes from a military capability. Our politicians are pretty incompetent, but our military is not, right? They'll even in Afghanistan and Iraq, they acquitted themselves extremely well. It's just when you're a Politico and you get into the details and you tell people that they can only have 2,500 troops, you're going to have to close the most obvious air base that you would keep open, like Bagram, because you need more than that. Like, things like that. But since kind of the U.S. competitors like Russia and China acknowledge that, they've amped up their asymmetric capabilities. So what does that mean? Well, you have things like the Internet Research Agency. So you have this democratization of information. You have journalists who are trying to get clicks. You have a population that's increasingly diverging from each other through self-selection and dopamine hits. And you have different sources of information. And then you have kind of Russian and Chinese trolls that are trying to exacerbate the divisions, among the U.S. And to this day, like people will say, "Oh, Putin wanted Trump to win." He didn't care who won. All he cared about was that whoever won, it would be as divisive as possible for the U.S. population. And he succeeded, but he's playing his hand well. So you have all these things. There's even a book about it by Eli Pariser. It was written in 2012. It's called The Filter Bubble, and it talks about this effect. So that's kind of what I think led to kind of the Charlie Hebdo effect. Then COVID came.